All right, I'll get started. I'm sure a lot of people are doing what I did yesterday, which was I popped around between 3 different sessions or so at a time, which is kind of the upside of the virtual conference. Hello, everyone. We are presenting to you from the East Coast and West Coast today. And kind of to intro what we're going to be talking about today, these are topics that intersect with my work personally, but are sort of outside of my day-to-day maybe policy and things I'm working on in an in-depth way. But I've met these fine folks that are joining me today on the panel over the years and befriended them sort of rapidly because they're super smart in their respective fields. And I think they've got really great insights, and they are kind enough to answer my phone calls and chat with me from time to time about what they're seeing in the world and the markets, so that I can just have a better understanding in the work that I do and for my own personal curiosity in this space. So I titled the panel, on a bleary night before these were due, Reading the Tea Leaves, because I think nobody really knows everything that's going to happen in the future here, especially post-COVID. But these are, wanted to have a conversation with some really smart people around what's happening in the retail and e-commerce space, a really hot topic, and then the real estate space and the intersection between retail and real estate, as well as something that's been talked about a lot at this conference. What does return to work look like? What does office real estate look like, et cetera? And so I've brought in some, again, really smart people that I go to for their insights on what's happening with current trends and predictive trends. I may chime in here and there with my own opinions, but I will mostly let them do the talking. Little bit of background myself for those that don't know me. My name's Kelly Rula. I work for the Seattle Department of Transportation. I lead our new mobility, emerging mobility group. So we do everything from manage the micromobility programs to do autonomous vehicle planning and policy, to a lot of data work behind the scenes, to e-cargo bikes coming soon. And we also have to think about the intersection between land use and transportation a lot. And I like to know what's going on in the markets. I'm going to next let Sucharita Kodali introduce herself, another one of my fine panelists.
Well, thank you, Kelly. It's always fun to talk at Urbanism Next, and no, I'm glad that you take my phone calls, so it's mutual. I'm a retail analyst at a company called Forrester Research, which is a technology research company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I am dialing in today from Charlotte, where I live, and I've been working in the e-commerce world with companies, retailers, and brands who have supported e-commerce for the last couple of decades. I also work with a lot of the technology service providers in the space too.
And now Andy Burke from Terreno Realty.
Introduce Morning, yourself. Everyone. Yeah, and thank you, Kelly, for having me on the panel. I don't do many panels, so this is a big deal for me, so I appreciate it. Little background on myself and our company. We are a publicly traded real estate investment trust. We focus on industrial infill real estate in coastal markets. So in that regard, we focus purely on 6 markets: Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, DC, and Miami. And we run the gamut of sort of development, redevelopment, owning and acquiring assets. And my industry certainly has gone through a rapid change over the past 10 years. And excited to kind of explore what we're seeing within my product type and other product types we see in the urban environment.
Great. Thank you both. So to set the stage, we're going to have a conversation today. We decided not to do PowerPoint, so get a little break from screens. As I said in the very beginning, like most of you, you're probably bouncing between sessions, so you might be on mobile, so it's a little bit easier. So today we wanted to discuss sort of what does it mean, what's going to happen with COVID, post-COVID, We're lucky enough to have Sucharita here, who, if you all attended last year's pandemic version of the Urbanism Next, did a keynote on sort of right in the midst of everything in May of last year. So we want to kind of check in with her on, predictions and things like that. And then kind of see how this all between e-commerce, retail, and real estate relates back to what does this mean for the future of cities, and how do we, as city planners and others in that more public sector focused space, think about the future really and watch the markets in order to be able to respond appropriately, especially in the immediate term, next few years. So we'll kind of set the stage here. And I'm going to be reading from some questions here. Yeah, where have we been? Where are we going? So we'll start with Sucharita. You're an expert on retail and e-commerce trends. What are you currently seeing in the industry now in light of everything? And as I just mentioned, Sucharita presented last year and gave kind of a big forward-looking talk. And did things turn out like you predicted? What surprised you or didn't?
Well, when we step back and look at the big change, certainly more people purchased through e-commerce. That was the biggest change. But there were certain categories that were the disproportionate winners there. Categories like grocery, categories like restaurant delivery. We actually didn't see great growth in more of the discretionary goods. A lot of those categories were flat to down overall. And a lot of the spikes happened early in the pandemic. So I think when people, you may have heard expressions like, oh, we leapfrogged 10 years or whatever the number was, much of that was a Q2 number. What we have seen subsequent to that is a little bit more stabilization. We expect actually that we're still expecting that e-com in 2021 will grow over 2022. So there are going to be gains that will certainly stay, but the biggest gains are going to happen in those discretionary categories where people are going back to purchasing, and where we will see the declines are with the grocery purchases, because consumers are going to go back to physical grocery stores where they've been purchasing for years and years, and they will go back to restaurants as well. So the restaurant delivery world, will also stabilize. DoorDash, as you probably saw, had this blockbuster IPO. Remains to be seen whether their stock continues to be as strong as it is. So some high level thoughts there.
And anything kind of shocking or surprising that didn't pan out the way you might have thought last May?
Oh, yes, the shocking and surprising stuff. I would say that more than anything, it was the resilience in certain regions that we saw, where, particularly in the South, where the closures weren't as strong as they were in other parts of the country. And what you saw was just consumers, continuing to eat in restaurants. And it was really, if anything, the biggest impediments were legal restrictions on, and county restrictions on the percent of people that could go into a venue, or how the capacity of the venue at any given moment in time. And that still seems to be the big impediment that is holding back certain sectors, like in particular the restaurant sector. I would say that the biggest surprise has been that we have not seen as much of a shakeout in all of physical retail as we expected. So given because I spoke last May, which was at like the depths of everything. And it seemed that there would be massive bankruptcies, massive shakeout of the entire restaurant sector. The PPP loans were coming in and providing a little bit of a lifeline, but the thinking was, if this pandemic continues, these companies are not going to be able, these small firms especially, are not going to be able to survive. What we've subsequently seen is about maybe a 10 to 15% shakeout in the restaurant sector, at least according to the National Restaurant Association. I think even that could be a little bit exaggerated because some of the Yelp numbers are more optimistic than that. And what that points to is that this catastrophe in a low margin, very capital intensive business, these businesses have still been surprisingly resilient. And whether that is by the sheer will of the entrepreneurs behind them, whether it's government funding, whether it is consumers stepping out and supporting these local businesses as best they can, these companies have nonetheless survived when this was supposed to be the worst thing since this was supposed to be worse than the Great Depression. And it actually hasn't. And also the wealthy have gotten wealthier in that period, in this same period of time. And I think that that's buoyed a lot of what we've seen from a decent economic recovery, insofar as you can call this an economic recovery.
Yep, exactly. So Andy, you're the real estate expert here, especially at this intersection between warehousing and fulfillment and urban centers. So what are you seeing out there? And as you look back at last year, do you have any surprises?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I would definitely echo the last set of commentary. It wasn't just the different businesses affected. It was the sheer volume of unemployment that seemed to be affecting the economy. And so we certainly viewed in May and June, and that this was going to be at the very minimum, a severe recession that was going to affect essentially everybody. However, policy response was overwhelming, and it didn't just fix a recession. It actually has been stimulative, and we have more stimulus coming, an extraordinary amount. So what was surprising to us was, one, the resiliency of a recession that never happened. Two, at the same time, all of the things that made cities unique and that made cities a destination for both people and capital and businesses became liabilities almost overnight. So transit-oriented cities that had great developments near, public transport. No one's taking public transport anymore. So all the serendipity of having interactions at restaurants doesn't happen anymore. People aren't going into offices anymore. People are staying at home. So the amount of deliveries that happened sort of to residences versus commercial flipped. It used to be sort of 60-40 commercial to residential. Now it's all of a sudden it's 80% residential and 20% commercial. So those are all the surprising components. E-commerce, I agree with Sucharita. It spiked and then everything kind of got back to normal. However, most of the people in our business are expecting it to continue to grow at an accelerated pace. And so they are trying to set up supply chains, both outward and return, that address that new reality of, likely I may never work at home on a Friday ever again, right? So even if you have 2 or 3 days less in the office in urban centers, that's going to radically change the use of the street retail landscape, office buildings, public transport, where goods are being pushed. When you have impulse buys on your lunch breaks, that doesn't happen anymore when you're at home. So all those things are radically changing. However, I would say, much like the pent-up demand comments that we just discussed, all roads still lead to Rome. So at some point, we believe it'll come back, but it is very unclear what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, and it may take that long considering what's happening inside cities at the moment.
Great. And I was going to add a little bit on cities, sort of my perspective. It's been a really hard year for cities. And I think I tend to catastrophize just personally. So I certainly thought that the bottom was falling out and we were completely screwed. And I think it's also heartening to hear these experts tell me that, like, no, what you're seeing is true. Like, things have stabilized, and I do think we'll see more improvements with the stimulus. But I think it was an interesting year for resilience, an interesting year for experimentation, hopeful, optimistic things from sort of, like, again, my world around transportation. I saw groups and cities sort of take an agile approach to piloting and implementation, which is something we don't tend to do. The slow streets, the streeteries, the temporary food loading zones that you saw across the country and in Seattle, that was an iterative approach. So, not trying to launch the perfect thing first, but just get things on the ground, just make something better, do something. That was really encouraging, especially being in the world I live in around innovation. And then some of the, more pessimistic things I still see, traffic's returning to near pre-pandemic levels here in Seattle, and no one's going to work. So, I can do math and say more people are driving and in single occupancy vehicles. I think that it's going to take really aggressive policy that's maybe at tension with economic recovery as we move forward. And I'm certainly curious how that's going to play out in major metros across the country. When is it safe to get back to transit, which, in Seattle here, we've seen ridership down 70% on our bus system. And we had one of the highest penetration numbers in the country before that. So, as a very downtown employer focused from a real estate perspective approach in Seattle, I am curious, we'll talk about a little bit more, but kind of where should we be focusing and what does that mean? But definitely some hopeful things on the kind of agility and implementation front. So I like to say, again, I'm the doomsday person. So I'm always saying like, oh, it's the death of retail. Like it's in the nails in the coffin. Sucharita is holding me back here. So, but we've seen this shift. I mean, it's undeniable that we've seen a shift to e-commerce and away from brick and mortar. And so Sucharita, what can we expect in the near future? And do we think these trends are going to continue that you just mentioned, or, kind of stabilize? And I guess a big question I have is a lot of that, especially movement to grocery and food delivery that we saw in the pandemic. You kind of hit on this, but how much of that is going to be persistent? That's truly a systemic behavior change shift versus sort of the short-term response to the pandemic.
Those are great questions. When we ask consumers, what do you plan to do after the pandemic? There are certain behaviors that we know will stick. So people started doing things like online banking a lot more through the pandemic, which is interesting because some of the most common storefronts and the ones that are opening are banks, right? So it'll be very interesting to see if that kind of what happens to the physical bank. Are they going to be able to keep the traffic coming to their locations, or are they even going to get an ROI from those physical locations? We've certainly heard people saying that they are planning on shopping more online, continuing to. I think that is what that means is that there's going to be a lot more online browsing. And the reason that has an impact on physical stores is that one of the biggest metrics that stores look at is dwell time. And I think that ultimately has to die. It becomes irrelevant in an omni-channel world if you're doing all your pre-shopping online. An adjunct to that online shopping is more curbside pickup. Now that's going to be an interesting one because some merchants are going to continue to do curbside. Companies like Walmart and Target, this is part of their strategy moving forward. There's no question about that. But when you look at other retailers who have offered curbside through the course of the pandemic, curbside is not cheaper. You would rather get people into your store. You are doing shopping for the customer. It's essentially a personal shopping, concierge shopping service, and it adds costs or it takes away from your margin. So either you have to increase your prices, which very few retailers have the luxury to do, or you have to you're going to have to charge customers more for that service, and few people want to pay for that. So then does that just drive people back to the physical store? The one place where curbside has long been existent, and it's essentially very minimal ad, is in the quick service restaurant space. So that will likely continue. But those are probably the single biggest ones. We've also seen more adoption of digital payments, touchless payments, and the concerns around, I think, infection spread I think that will actually be a positive byproduct for years to come. And we saw that with SARS in Asia. We'll probably see 1% of people who will wear masks no matter what in public settings. And it will be socially acceptable to do so. And, and what we'll also see is, just more of that caution and kind of an interest in doing things like those touchless payments, which have that benefit of not only being digital transactions, and there's a lot of speed and accuracy that's associated with that, but also you have, kind of some of these issues related to just infection spread. I mean, one of the great byproducts, one of the only positive byproducts I think of the pandemic has been that this seasonal flu season has been like record low levels of the seasonal flu, right? So I think that there are things that have come out of this that we will take with us for months and years to come.
Yeah, Andy, I'm curious to kind of shift the lens a little on the real estate space and sort of your thoughts on retail brick and mortar and what you're seeing in your kind of niche space as well, that urban industrial, like what's happening right now, and how are you guys kind of planning for the near term, long term?
Well, for us, from we can tell, most of our customers want to be closer and closer to the density of the urban environment. So most of our buildings that we're trying to acquire and operate, and the people who are showing up, are not the local tenants that they used to be. They're national tenants. But I completely agree with Sucharita that the people who have home court advantage and already have those retail locations close to the customers, Walmart's going to use that. Target's going to use that. Costco's going to use that, right? Costco has been very late to the e-commerce game. They are not going to fumble it now. They have rented a lot of our spaces trying to get that last mile, and in fact bought Sears's old home delivery business to and actually do that. So, however, omni-channel is here to stay. Retailers have to respond to whatever the customer wants to do, whether that's a mobile buy, an in-person buy, and in some cases they are going to have margin erosion. But for the most part, I think the things that, to kind of bring it back to the urban environment, when internet penetration of e-commerce gets to certain levels in other countries, the UK comes to mind, when it starts hitting towards 30%, Main Street takes a hit. There's no doubt about it, right? And so right now with some brands, they don't want to be inside Macy's. They want to have their own special boutique that has a relationship with a customer. So in that regard, I think large format retail is incredibly under pressure in the urban environments that has multiple different brands inside. Smaller retail, I mean, I know Nordstrom is one example. They're trying to do just basically dressing rooms, essentially, in most of their new initiatives. So people come in, try stuff on, stuff gets sent to their house, or it's ready to pick up, or they do returns. So I do think there's going to be some retail shrinkage and footprints. So, your downtown Macy's, hard to see how that survives as well in the next 10 years as it did in the last 30 years. I think the other big issue for people is sales taxes and basically general land use, right? So I think one of the big issues for cities and municipalities is the old mall that gave you lots of sales tax receipts won't get as many point of sales. So how do you restructure, how do you actually get the taxes that are coming to home deliveries versus downtown Main Street or your local mall? Because those are all under immense pressure. And I think the last component is, again, if work from home is even 2 days a week, that is a 40% change in people's habits, right? That is a massive change to where people are physically and how they're gonna wanna shop. And that's still, I think at this point, unclear, but people are trying to get closer to wherever those people are gonna be.
Which could be downtown, could be home, seems like that's a bit chaotic, I would think, especially on the real estate side, kind of like where do you hedge right now? And it's expensive to do both, right? So let's see, pivot back a bit to Sucharita here, and something that's come up in the other parts of the conference, and something I think that we all maybe have on our minds, especially at the city, that we don't really have access to this data is, who are these customers that have sort of been added to this lift in the e-commerce penetration that happened in the pandemic? Do you know much about sort of who and how people are spending? So I think that's really interesting and also helps us kind of bring that intersect back to the brick and mortar too.
Yeah, when we looked at by age breakouts, who was purchasing more in a category like, say, online grocery or restaurant delivery, we tended to see younger people, younger families actually were some of the biggest adopters of anything and everything online, for all the logical reasons. I mean, these are people who are working from home and on Zoom all day and often managing childcare. And they have disposable income so they can spend it on delivery fees if they needed to. So that's often what we would see is it was often people who may have historically gone to malls or grocery stores shifting more of their share to the e-commerce channel. In the restaurant sector, we also saw a lot of millennials, the youngest demographics. They were certainly ordering more from the Postmates and the DoorDashes of the world. Where we actually saw the least penetration, there was certainly growth because there was growth everywhere in e-commerce, but I've heard a lot of questions around, kind of, are these older people? Is it the holdouts that, really, really shifted online? And I can't say that that's a demographic that has drastically changed its behavior. That's still, for the most part, a demographic that is shopping in stores. Remember, through the whole pandemic, every store had senior shopping hours. That was actually something that they did very, very early on to absolutely try to be customer centric. Now, it didn't always work in everybody's advantage. I mean, my parents and in-laws, like they'd go during the senior hours and they were like, that's more crowded than if I go later. So I'm just going to go later. But they were still, kind of continuing going to the store, and old habits die hard. I mean, these are people who for decades are used to, touching their produce and, not having things delivered to them. So I think that it was definitely a younger demographic thing. And then it'll be interesting to see if those working families continue their e-commerce transactions. I think that we were just in a very unique situation with childcare and kind of the at home constraints that had precipitated a lot of the e-com piece. But as schools reopen, as these people leave their homes and are commuting again at least a few days a week, do the old habits resume? And my hunch is that they will.
Yeah, and I think it's something that I don't know, there's a lot of assumptions about kind of who's shopping more. And yeah, it's helpful to kind of have some experts weigh in sometimes because I think we tend to make a lot of assumptions as city planners. Let's see, Andy, we talked a little bit about this, but kind of walk us a little bit more through sort of this residential commercial split that we're all seeing with the deliveries to home. I'm actually seeing that in some data that in a project that I have around freight movements and how just in the pandemic, deliveries have shifted significantly to the residential destination right away from commercial. And so I'm curious kind of how are you seeing this translate in the real estate market? And do you follow housing real estate at all? And then the sort of office real estate, I think maybe just dig in a little more to that.
Yeah, so a couple of things I think that are interesting to talk about that. So certainly in the middle of the pandemic, habits simply switched because, as everyone said, everyone was at home, children, parents. So food habits changed dramatically. Basic needs changed dramatically. You didn't have a chance to stop at Walgreens at lunch, right, and pick up your children's Motrin and go home, right? So things like that just radically changed. So at the height, from we understand from UPS and other people, 80% of all deliveries were going to residences, whereas typically it was usually 40%. Now, that is slowly ebbing down, slowly but surely. The question is, where does it settle out? And basically where I think most of us are coming from, particularly from my seat here in San Francisco, right? Many of the large employers here, Salesforce being the most visible, are giving back space and are saying that their footprint is going to shrink. The typical amount of shrinkage on a footprint is usually 20 to 30%. That's usually what we see. And they're also talking about how they're going to radically change how people use offices, right? How you collaborate. There may be certain days a week that you have to be in the office so everyone can actually collaborate, but other days are flex days. So what we're seeing in that regard is there is going to be some permanent change. I personally am on the side that people want to interact. Companies want to be innovative. I think that all of us who work well and are successful have built up goodwill over many, many years and have been eating that goodwill over Zoom. Eventually, you have to be in person with people. And I think eventually that's how you actually are competitive and successful, both from a personal perspective and a professional perspective. So I do think it doesn't go to permanent work from home, even though some of the tech companies here are saying that. I don't believe it. So I do think that if you look at where people have historically wanted to be, and I do have a historical perspective on this as a history major, people want to be in cities. People have repopulated cities after the Black Plague, smallpox, all sorts of things that were much more virulent and much more devastating on a mortality rate by wide factors compared to what we've seen today. So I think old habits will come back, but they will be adjusted. So for example, most of the industrial people are trying to find ways, instead of delivering pallets, to deliver packages. It is inherently much less efficient to deliver 5 pallets of toothpaste than delivering to you, Kelly, a thing of toothpaste, a nail clipper, and whatever else might be on your agenda that day. It just isn't the same supply chain. So smaller nodes, closer into the cities. You guys, I'm sure everyone's already seen it. Amazon vans, individual deliveries have gone up dramatically. I don't think that goes down as much as everyone thinks. I do think that people are setting up more nodes to have more vans coming in more neighborhoods. And I think that other people besides Amazon who are going to start promising quicker deliveries that aren't just coming to their shop and grabbing it on the way to work. It's going to be going to your house. So office utilization will be down. I think some hotel and travel will be down for business for a long period of time because it's so cost efficient. And we do pay attention to apartments very much because we pay attention to spending and where that spending is. Personally, if you look around, there's some odd things happening right now. Certainly New York City has gotten some press in the Wall Street Journal where local apartment owners have been taking apartments off the market, right? Simply reducing supply to try and address a short-term issue. However, again, to reiterate, I do think people want to come back and live in a city. No 22-year-old wants to live isolated, not meeting people, not being able to meet your future mate or partner, right? You want to be there. You want to interact. You want that urban environment where you can see and be seen. And so I think it comes back, but it will take some time. It will take some time because the housing is there and people want to take it when the prices come down.
Yeah, quick follow on that. You said office utilization down, just kind of digging into this a little bit more. Do you see, and this kind of question for both of you, but do you see opportunities for like more conversion zoning? Like, do cities need to be thinking about how they can repurpose? I know certainly I'm not an expert in this, but I know mixed use that with retail requirements on the ground floor has had issues, in my neighborhood in Seattle and other places where they can't fill the space. So what, from a real estate perspective, I guess, what is the near-term picture if we have significant office utilization down and a lot of supply? It sits fallow, or
there's not a lot of easy options for that. Some office buildings can be repurposed. Certainly there's been a lot of office buildings repurposed as hotels. I don't think anyone's going to be sitting here saying I need more hotel rooms in my city in the next 5 years. I mean, New York City, as an example, is so over-hoteled, it's a joke. So I think the matter is, yes, most cities love to say, let's put retail on the ground floor and put apartments on top. There is some demand for that, but eventually you saturate it. And I think the trends towards e-commerce don't bode well for that. I think the issue right now with footprints, so right now in San Francisco, for example, office utilization is probably 10%. if you look at the key card access, it's very, very low. It's probably the lowest. And the highest are, Texas and Florida, and they're pushing 30, 40, 50%. So that's a wide dispersion. That's 100% government restrictions. I think that will change. But there's not a lot of easy answers when Square gives back a whole building and Twitter gives back a whole building and Salesforce stops taking more space. And says that, and Nordstrom, I think in your own hometown, just said they're going to reduce their office footprint by 30%. Boeing's going to reduce their office footprint by 35%. These are big numbers. And so there isn't easy answers because these buildings are not set up, nor is the zoning set up for it. So it'll take some time and have to get cheap enough, which unfortunately means paying for it to actually make sense.
Yeah. Oh man, lots to think about. So I'm going to pivot back to something you've both touched on, and we sort of had a longer chat about the other day, but last mile delivery, and obviously the trend. So, yes, e-commerce has increased. We've talked about that. I think, in cities especially too, there and generally there's this discussion around the last mile. Oh, it's the most expensive. It's really hard. And we've also seen, even from my background, like ultra fast delivery didn't exist 5 years ago, and in the extent it does now, at least, and now it is sort of become more and more normal. Now, interesting caveat, in the midst of the pandemic, we saw Amazon slow down their delivery times and delays, and so it's a little bit of a tension there. But I'm curious, both of your thoughts on where are we going with the speed of delivery, and then digging a little bit into that long-term cost trajectory, because yes, more people are purchasing e-commerce, but I don't necessarily know that always means that scale results in reduced costs, at least for all players, maybe some players. So I'm curious, we can start with Sucharita, just talking about last mile. You talked about curbside a bit, but there's a lot to unpack here in the sort of what's the future hold and what do the costs look like?
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this over the years. There is a lot about e-commerce last mile that's just not sustainable, and it continues to be unsustainable. It is the most expensive way to get packages and get products from wherever it needs to go to a person. You really, if you want to be efficient, you need to cluster pickups, you need to cluster deliveries, you need to let people go pick up things when they're on the way somewhere and pick up multiple things all at once. Like, that's really ultimately the best way to drive efficiency. Unfortunately, there are negative externalities in e-commerce that we are paying for as consumers. We pay through pollution, we pay through road wear and tear, we pay through, kind of drivers backing into our mailboxes, whatever the case may be. I mean, kind of in, kind of the wall outside my neighborhood has been hit, like, over the years, like 3 times by delivery drivers of various sorts. So I mean, these are our negative externalities that we have to bear. And I've been saying for years that city planners need to tax these things. They need to change and shift the behavior. And the way that you do that is you do that through forcing pickup points or forcing delivery surcharges, or, kind of every time a truck comes into a neighborhood, and there are, studies on, kind of the wear and tear on a local road that cities have to pay for when there are more trucks in that neighborhood. And when, 3 Amazon trucks and 2 FedEx trucks and a UPS truck is coming through your neighborhood every single day, that is a material increase in, kind of the reparations that are needed. So, or, there's just a lot that needs to be thought through. And I feel like we've been talking about this for long enough. And I think it's time for cities to step up and do this. Whether, I mean, even in urban centers, to force, trucks to go to certain destinations. Like, you just can't randomly, kind of just stop on the middle of a curb somewhere and hold up all the traffic behind you to deliver somebody their Shake Shack burger. I mean, that's just not, that's just not the negative externalities all around.
I love that example. Yes, we have been talking about this for years, and yes, I would love to do a tax. But I'm sure Andy has some thoughts on that. So I'll go to him first, then I can circle back.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of things that, and actually, Sucharita, I think most cities are wholly underestimating the sheer volume that's coming, even beyond what's happening now. I think there's more to come, not less, just because individual packages take up more space than a pallet. It just and although it is true to be said that everyone is subsidizing these deliveries. Okay, so at some point they have to charge different rates, which may change the take up and utilization of it by the public. Whether that be taxes, which I alluded to earlier. I think cities have to be much more important point of destination versus point of sales on their tax policies, or if that's forcing radical land use changes, which is really what you guys are talking about, right? Cities were designed for you and I to do the last mile. And they have been doing that since the modern era of cars. So any city that's been built since World War II is designed for the car, or somewhat public transport if you're not if you're not in the East Coast. And so that has to radically change because the day-to-day lives of these people are changing. And so maybe we have to demolish some downtown office buildings for turnarounds. I don't know. But it has to be more efficient, and it has to be mandated, I think, a little bit by the government. Because right now, a perfect example, in New York City now, people are building multi-story warehouses in the boroughs. And let's say they go 4 stories up. 1-2 stories is going to be warehouse, but maybe 1 to 3 stories is going to be purely parking for vans. And that's not just for deliveries, it's going to be picking up your returns. And so whether it's mandating certain hours or changing how the land is used, I think that city planners are underestimating the sheer volume of traffic that's going to be generated by these warehouses going forward. But I do not think a customer is going to go backwards. I mean, the joke I like to make with people all the time, I used to go on airplanes and not have the internet, and I thought nothing of it. Now I got an airplane, there's no internet. It's like the world's ended. The whole airplane loses its marbles. Okay, and it's nothing. It's 2 hours. Why can't you wait for a certain time of day to get your package, right? Or go to a certain place for your package? It's going to be a change, but it's going to be hard, and it may have to be government mandated. But it's not going to go backwards, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. Oh man, this is definitely one of my favorite topics on Last Mile. And what the government should be doing, and I agree with both of you on taxes and also completely underestimating the impacts in this space. And then something, we're trying to grapple with in Seattle, or I guess trying to push, is this idea of consumer education around this too, which sounds kind of cheeseball. But I think we talk, certainly in the transportation planner space, there's a lot of talk about mode shift and transportation demand management and like get out of your car and get on the bus. And I think that while people intuitively know, like if I order something super fast, it's probably not great. And also, as Amanda's presentation yesterday and Danielle and them discussed, if you're just sort of adding deliveries to what is also where you're going to brick and mortar still, and you're doing additive trips, you sort of intuitively know you're not like saving the environment that way. But I do think it's just not as front and center as well, and like how people are making decisions. Obviously, pricing can help impact that, land use, regulation, zoning, etc. But I do feel like there's a role for the public sector to play in education more in the same way we do around how you get around on a personal trip. So that's something like we're trying to tool around with and working with the Urban Freight Lab at UW a little bit on how can we kind of think about that more and kind of be a little more aggressive maybe in our messaging.
Well, it's a huge challenge, right? Because we all know no city like New York City is not going to build another tunnel, right? Seattle's not going to build another 5. So you have the same arteries. So how are you going to get a tremendous new volume of goods, people, trucks, and services in the same network? It's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I won't go on. Oh, go ahead, Sucharita.
Oh, well, I mean, in terms of educate, you're absolutely right, Kelly. I mean, I think that there needs to be a PR campaign. I mean, just like, we've had campaigns to stop people from drunk driving, or, we stop people from smoking or wearing seatbelts. I mean, there just needs to be a public awareness campaign of, the impact of what some people call dirty deliveries. I mean, you should understand what is the environmental impact of delivery versus, getting things, picking things up on your own. I mean, and this extends even further than just e-commerce deliveries. I mean, there needs to be a full understanding of retail supply chains, which are quite pollutive and very, very unsustainable. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity. The issue is that there are very few authorities on measuring this stuff.
Yeah.
And, there is just so much greenwashing and so much nonsense that's thrown out there about we're so sustainable, or, we are amazing for the environment. And it's like, really? I mean, you're FedExing a package. Like, how is that sustainable? So anyway, I mean, there's just a lot that needs to be thought through.
Yes, completely agree. And I'm, I guess my one last point on this particular topic is I feel that we have been talking about this for a while. I mean, you and I, Sucharita, for sure, but I think this isn't a new concept of like, we need to deal with urban freight. And I bringing it back to the panel, I look back on the last year and I think about, oh man, what would have happened if we only had a 50-cent per package tax? I mean, that revenue would have been critical this year when we were all scrambling, certainly in the public sector, to slash budgets and like preserve staff and cut projects. And, it's one of those that obviously we lag things, but we've been sort of like quick to go after certain markets like Uber and Lyft. TNCs have gotten a lot of attention. And this is a much bigger market. I mean, billion-dollar market, billions of dollars, maybe trillions. You probably know this, both of you. And we're not able to manage it. We're not able to understand it, and we're not even to tap into some funds to do so. So anyway, I won't go on my rant, but it's
Yeah, no. I think it's a great one. And one quick point, because Andy alluded to it earlier with respect to sales tax. So one of the most interesting things was that at the state level, e-commerce has now been forced to pay sales taxes. And what has been fascinating about this entire transition is that what that has been is that that's been a lifesaver for a lot of state budgets. So whatever they lost in the physical sales tax, they did make up quite a bit in the e-com side. So state budgets were okay, but you're absolutely right. Like, that's a different pool. That's not going to help the city of Seattle or Charlotte or, these municipalities that need to be also making these same calculated decisions. So I hear you. I'm with you. And, there's so much from a technology standpoint, even beyond e-commerce, that governments have been asleep at the wheel.
Preach. Well, okay, we got like 15 minutes left. There's a few questions that I'm going to try to kind of tease into kind of a nice, let's put a bow on it. And kind of, I like that we're not talking about cities. And I think that's a question for a lot of folks that are on this, call and city planners and thinking about, okay, what do we do? So we sort of see some trends. We had some good discussion about that. What should cities be focused on right now? In Seattle, there's a lot of attention on downtown recovery. Again, our downtown was our kind of retail, cultural, our Pike Place market, Amazon and the major office towers. There's also more residential than there used to be, for sure, but it was a mixed use, so to speak, economic zone. And I feel there's a lot of talk, and yet not a lot of tangible like tactics of where can cities focus and how can they be strategic. To Andy's point, people will come back to cities. We may see some people kind of, there may be a little bit of disillusion there, but it will return and the robustness will return. But what policies, what should we be focusing on? like, should we be changing zoning laws? And I think there's downstream implications from that maybe aren't great for vibrancy and kind of public life perspective too. You know, making a fulfillment center out of an office tower. Like, I don't know, trade-offs, right? So I don't know, start with Andy here on this one, and just sort of what does this mean for cities? What should we be thinking about in the near term? And again, thinking about that vibrancy, kind of livability, the futures of cities that we want to see, which was a big theme of this conference.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, people like to make fun of the post office, but the post office actually knows how to deliver packages. And what they need is forward nodes, right? So cities need to allow, you know, package delivery companies to have more access closer into stage so that they don't have to stage in the street. Now, if that's reusing different pieces of land and changing the zoning, if that's repurposing other things, I think that's a huge issue. You know, obviously, from my perspective, although I'm in favor of taxes, but for things we talked about, I do think there's some things within cities that would help development and sort of get out of people's way in that regard. And for the most part, that is right now, most cities have some challenges with safety and perception. I think if you create a safe environment, I think if you can possibly give some you know, improvement zones that have some, you know, incentives for businesses to start, I think that's the best way to let the market tell you what it's supposed to be. I don't think cities or any central planning has proven to be particularly adept over the millennium that it's been tried. It works sometimes in the short term, but not in the long term. But I think that a little bit is just, I don't think you need radical changes. I think you need a lot of patience. And then I think you really need a lot of flexibility about what the market's going to need. You know, the high probability that cities become more residential. That's a positive, right? So more density, I think, would be helpful in cities where you actually create the infrastructure around that density for it to be effective. That may mean losing some retail, but setting up more delivery zones and pickup areas. That's a trade-off. And then if you tax correctly, you're not losing revenue, you're adapting the revenue, right? So those are the things that come to mind. But certainly, again, if cities are utilized 20% less, 40% less on an ongoing basis, there's going to be some changes required on how you use the land and buildings that you have.
Sucharita?
I think, Andy, you just said something that I think could be what is really the future of a lot of that real estate that goes away. I mean, I look in a city like Charlotte, where I am, where right now there's an undersupply of housing. And, you know, I mean, do a lot of those buildings get repurposed as different types and different price points of residential? And I mean, the why were people not living in the city in the first place was often because, you know, maybe you could get more space elsewhere. And if you can redevelop and create that same quality of property, and oh, by the way, you have the proximity and the adjacency for all the amenities that cities provide, it actually, the trade-off becomes very, very different in the future. Now, there's a transition to get to that point, of course. So what do cities need to do? And this is where you just need to survive. You need to make sure that you're paying, you know, kind of collecting, you know, all the taxes that you can to pay your bills, making sure that, you know, you're not defaulting on debt, and that, you know, you're making your ends meet. I mean, that's what every business that is struggling through the pandemic is doing, is just survival mode, getting all the aid that you can, pulling all the strings that you need to do to make sure that there are no gaps. And then you figure out your plan for your pivot if there is going to be this massive pivot, which we all think seems likely. That, you know, I mean, if the offices are going to shake out, you got to redevelop that space. But, you know, I mean, it's an interesting question. I wonder what the office piece is going to ultimately be, because I have seen over the years, and we've probably all seen it, so many CEOs that say we're going to have work from home policy, and then like 5 years later a new CEO comes in and it's like, everybody back in the office 5 days a week, you know. And I feel like I know so many CEOs who just don't like the idea of work from home. So it's whoever's the boss, and what that person thinks. And I mean, it's just really interesting. I think that we'll have to wait and see, because I think that kind of, even though it seems like, just because it's possible to work from home, ultimately there is one person at every company that's going to make that call, not, kind of the thousands of people who are the direct reports. And if that person at the top says everybody needs to be in the office, everybody's going to come back into the office.
Yeah, so interesting. Sidebar, but my husband runs an international nonprofit, so his whole team is remote, and he's always worked from home for 15 plus years. And so when we're all having these conversations, he just doesn't understand. He's literally never worked in an office. So it's all about framing, right? And I think, like you said, there's a lot of historical, experiential, behaviors that we've all had over the years going into offices. And I think it's going to be definitely interesting about our perceptions now and in the future. Great points about the taxes. I think, to me, those are like key takeaways for me around, we've got to rethink the revenue streams and related to new zoning, and make some maybe hard trade-offs around, replacing a retail with fulfillment center strategically, like being more strategic about that, so it doesn't kill vibrancy, but it allows the necessary things to happen that are taking place in the market. And then there was a question around innovation, and I think now I can't remember which one of you said it, but flexibility. So survival and flexibility. And to me, again, I feel like the positives from this year were like, wow, look, cities can do stuff fast when they really need to. They can respond to the public. They can respond to needs. They can do it without a huge grant or like $1 billion budget. And I think we need to continue to bring that mentality, like going like post-COVID recovery does not mean like we go back to the old ways of how we approach everything. It needs to be continuing to be flexible and nimble, which obviously, I feel like in the early days of this was how all the businesses were pitching, like how they've survived was like, we had to move fast, we had to pivot. And I think cities learned from that last year. And I really hope that doesn't just completely dissolve, like if we get back in the office, and yeah, and then I think there's a lot we don't know, right? Like you guys are really smart, and I think I'm usually trusting in your predictions, but at the end of the day, I think there's still uncertainty. I oscillate week by week now of like, there won't be weddings this summer. Oh wait, there definitely will be, or like, we all will be vaccinated, or who's going to be on transit. So I do think that this just flexibility and survival needs to continue to be the theme, and I'm excited and scared for what that means. And yeah, we had a question about downtown, which I think we hit on, a lot of uncertainty. And one other theme, sorry, from what we were just talking about that I've been thinking too, certainly in Seattle, affordable housing in the city period has been a huge topic. And I would love to see a vision that's like, we know we can't get there tomorrow, but yeah, let's convert some of these office towers into, high-rise affordable housing, or at least more affordable housing, right? I think that's a huge opportunity to bring people back downtown, which is what we've been really struggling with in a place like Seattle and San Francisco, with huge displacement for everyone that actually needs to come in and work in the city, especially in service jobs. So I think it's really interesting to see what's going to happen, and maybe we'll all come back in the next year and do a reflection on our reflection together, which I think will be fun. I think we're about at time, and I don't know if either of you had any parting words or anything to add before we go. But I thought this was a great discussion. We took up our time, which we thought we'd easily be able to do, and yeah, I want to thank everyone who joined today. And again, thanks to Sucharita and Andy for sharing your insights, and onward we go into the unknown. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for leading a great discussion, Kelly.
Thanks both.
Thanks for having me.